Hi, welcome to NCIX Tech Tips. Today we'll be covering the Core i7 CPU and X58 motherboard, and rather than do a product showcase as we've done in the past, we're going to be doing more of an overclocking oriented tech tips. We're going to show you how to get the most out of your new Core i7 CPU, X58 board, and triple channel memory. Okay, so we'll do a quick what you need for overclocking your Core i7 CPU. First of all, you will need a Core i7 CPU and a matching X58 motherboard. X58 is the only chipset that supports the Core i7. It is also the only chipset that supports triple channel memory. You can see here we've got 12 gigs, so that's 2 triple channel kits of memory in our test system here. Now you'll also need a good quality power supply. So in our test system we're using a Corsair HX 1000 watt power supply. And this is an optional thing. You can go with air cooling or you can go for a more extreme cooling system. In our case, we are using a liquid cooling system. Core 2 Duo overclocking was relatively simple. You had a front side bus and then you had CPU and RAM multipliers. So your CPU speed is derived by front side bus times your CPU multiplier. Same with the RAM speed. However, for Core i7, it's a lot different. You have what's called a base clock and then you have several multipliers, 2 of which are actually in the CPU itself. So the first multiplier we're going to talk about is the QPI multiplier. So if I could get the cameraman to look at the screen behind me, you've got your QPI link speed. Now for all intents and purposes, this does not affect your performance that much. So to get the max overclock, we're going to turn our QPI multiplier down to the lowest. That'll show up as 36 or 18. Now that we've got our QPI speed low, the first thing you want to determine is what base clock your motherboard and CPU are capable of. This is affected by your CPU, by your motherboard, and to some extent by your cooling system. Now overclocking is always a crapshoot, so some people will get a higher base clock, other people will get a lower base clock. To find the max base clock, you set your QPI speed low, you want to set your memory multiplier to quite a bit lower than your memory is capable of, so we're setting it to 6 here. You're also going to set your CPU multiplier, which is way up at the top here, down to quite a bit lower than the actual CPU speed. We'll be using a 14x multiplier. And we are going to set our uncore multiplier also to quite low. Right here, we'll be using a 14x uncore multiplier. Now, you slowly drive up your base clock while increasing the frequency of the uncore, or the VTT, until you find a maximum. Most boards are going to top out around 180 to 210. Now our base clock limit on this motherboard and CPU combination happens to be around 200. So what we've done is we've determined our max base clock. That affects what kind of speeds we can get out of every other component. Now we're going to do the RAM. So we'll bring our base clock back down to 133, which is stock, and leave everything else the way it was. Now we're going to experiment with our memory multiplier. Now the Corsair memory we have in here is rated for 1600 megahertz at Cas8 timings. So we've got all our timings set by default. We're not going to mess around with those today. But we are going to set our memory multiplier to 12. That brings us to 1600. Now that's stock. We make sure it works, make sure it passes mem test, and then we can proceed to overclock the memory. Now you can see here, if I can get the cameraman to look really closely, as I increase the base clock, so I'm going to try 150, you can see the BIOS is automatically calculating that my memory is going to be running at 1800. Memory overclocking on Core i7 is, again, different from Core 2 Duo. You have to keep your voltages under 1.65 as recommended by Intel. Some people are going over. We're not sure what the long-term effects are yet. So, there you go, memory overclocking. The last thing, this is the most fun part, but we are going to leave it till the end, is finding the actual max voltage and max frequency of your Core i7. Now, you're going to want to keep all those other things we talked about before low. So we're setting our memory multiplier back down to 6 right here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put our CPU multiplier up to the stock multiplier of 20, which is for the Core i7 920. Then from there, we can take our base clock up slowly in intervals of about 10 until we start to reach a point where the board won't boot anymore or you can't get into Windows anymore. That is when you know you either have to raise the core voltage, and we recommend a max core voltage of about 1.25 volts, or you back it off a little bit and that's your max overclock on the core. We've glazed over the uncore a little bit. That's anything inside the Core i7 CPU that is not the actual processor. So that means it's got your integrated memory controller for your triple channel memory. It's got your caches, which are very important to CPU performance. And we can overclock the uncore a little bit, but performance improvements for overclocking the uncore have been shown to be pretty marginal. So you also can improve your RAM performance by overclocking the uncore. As soon as you start to load it up with lots of RAM, like we've done here, we've got 12 gigs of high-speed Dominator memory, a little bump in the uncore voltage, which is the memory controller as well, can start to give you slightly better speeds. So, in summary, we recommend a max 1.25 volt for the CPU, 1.65 volts for the RAM, and 1.45 volts for the uncore. Overclocking, running anything out of spec, is always a risk and it's never a guarantee, but we do have tools for testing to make sure that an overclock is stable and it's not going to corrupt your data. For the CPU, I recommend Prime 95, Orthos, or SuperPi. Those are all great tools for making sure a CPU overclock is stable. Now for the RAM, something like Memtest 86 is a great tool to tell you if your RAM is stable. Running, I'd say no fewer than 2 passes of Memtest 86 Plus should tell you whether your RAM has a stable overclock or not. Now I'm sorry we weren't able to cover as much about the features and what's new with the Core i7 processor as we usually do, but that was not the point of this article. We were focusing more on overclocking the Core i7. If you want an in-depth read on the Core i7 as well as the X58 chipset, check out the article at www.hardwarecanucks.com. Their coverage was excellent. Also, we didn't talk as much as we'd like to about the advantages of an Extreme Edition CPU. All that stuff we talked about, basically you don't have to deal with an Extreme Edition. All you have to worry about is the CPU multiplier, which is completely unlocked. You can go as high as you want, and the CPU voltage. So you can keep your RAM, your QPI, your uncore, your base clock, all within spec and still overclock your CPU that way. This is an example, actually, of another sort of extreme Core i7 system. We had the water-cooled one, and we're also showing this one with the Intel Smackover. We've got just 6 gigs of Corsair memory. I hit myself on the fan. And what you can also see in here is we're running Crossfire. In the system we showed you before, we were actually running SLI. So that's a very flexible advantage of X58 over any previous generation chipset. Depending on the board, you can run both SLI and Crossfire in the same board. Thanks for watching NCIX Tech Tips. I hope you've enjoyed our Core i7 overclocking guide. Oh, actually, one more thing. Just wanted to say, you may or may not have noticed, but we've had a bunch of different boards in front of us today. That was just to kind of showcase some of the great X58 overclocking boards. Also, I wanted to say special thanks to Smooth Creations for providing this case for our showcase Core i7 PC, as well as Intel and Corsair. We really couldn't have done it without them. And also Seiya from extremesystems.org. He did a great article on Nehalem or Core i7 overclocking, and it was the basis for a lot of what we did today. Thanks for watching NCIX Tech Tips.